Shabbat shalom, Shabbat shalom. Welcome, welcome, world changers. We're back another Sabbath. Can you imagine that? Another Sabbath. Seems like they go by so fast, right? Every time, every week just seems to go by faster and faster. But praise God that He brought us around to another Sabbath. And on this Sabbath is like last week. We have our special guest Onieh with us from Dead Sea Scrolls Religion and going through his version of the Book of Esther. A lot of awesome material that was covered last Saturday and last on Sunday as well, the day after that. And so he's going to continue with part 3 today. And so I'm going to bring him on in just a moment. But as usual, let me just take a little peek in the chat here first. So we have Calamentos says Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Shabbat Shalom, Calamentos. Psalm 94 says Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Shabbat Shalom, good to see you. Total Torah says, wow, what a talented pianist you are too, Onieh. All right. The Great Deception. Alan over there says, Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Shabbat Shalom, brother. Good to see you. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So, looking forward to what we're going to learn today. Now, again, if you have any questions, please put them in the live chat and address them to either myself or to Onieh. Just let me pull this up here. And we do ask that you stay on relatively on topic as well. Seeing that I would expect that Onieh's got a fair amount of material to cover here, and so we're just going to try to focus specifically on what Onieh is talking about, and anything else that's vaguely related to what he talks about, like what he's talking about, or anything that's really pressing on your heart, like any prayer request. Yes, please submit those, or anything like that. Anything of urgent nature, for sure. Please submit that in the live chat. But other than that, please just leave your questions in the live chat for Onieh. Just put at Onieh or at Christopher if you want to ask me specifically, or put both if you want, and we'll get that intermittently as we go along in the study today. All right. Okay, so I want y'all in the live chat to give a warm welcome to Onieh. He's no stranger to this channel. And by the way, we are streaming on multiple channels here. I think a couple different, Onieh is actually linking his Dead Sea Scrolls Religion channel, plus his Facebook, as well as my YouTube channel and Facebook, of course, and various other platforms as well. So welcome, welcome. And by the way, just before I pull Onieh on here, any of you that are watching right now, please, ask God for say, Lord, would you like me to send a message to somebody else to tune in to listen to this? And please do so. Please invite other people to listen. Send them a link. Send them a message. Say, hey, check out this live chat. See what you think. And so, Lord, the more the merrier. Calamento says, Shalom, Onieh. Alan says, Shabbat, Shalom, Onieh. And so, welcome, 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 Onieh. Good to see you again.
Shalom. Thanks for having me. Thanks for having me back again. Yes. I'm going to send you the file right now. Okay. What were you about to say?
No, just take it away, Onieh, and we'll let's pick up where you left off, or wherever you want to start.
Yeah, so I'm going to briefly explain again the fonts or the markings so people can follow along with what's being shared. And just as a heads up, I have what I'm sending you right now, which Christopher is going to be sharing with you guys on the screen share. I finally completed the entirety of the 4 versions, line by line, with the exception of one, like 2 or 3 sentences that seems to only occur in one version, and it's not. I had to double check to make sure it's only in the one version, because it's possible it might be in some of the other versions, but in a different place. So I didn't have time to figure that one out, because that one was a really complicated one. But besides that, I have finished the 4 versions for the part 2 process, and I did not finish including the variants that we can glean from Josephus. So we might, if we have time, we might look a little bit at Josephus, a few readings that I was not able to include. I only did about the first half of Esther from Josephus's readings, but the second half I didn't get a chance to include them yet. So I sent you the PDF. Did you see it?
Yeah, just give me a second here. I'll pull her up. All right. Just give me a minute here.
Yeah, no problem.
Just while I'm doing that, just welcome. A question for Move as well said, Shalom, Shalom, good to see you.
We will try to cover as much of Esther today as we can. I think that the plan is to finish all through Esther. So we'll do our best to be able to accomplish that.
Okay. So I was able to recover some of the other documents that you were using last time. So I just wanted to let me just pull this up here, and just a second
Okay.
here. I'll just pull this up, and I'll ask you what you need before we get started here. Do you need to go to like, is everything on PDF, or do you need to go to like a web based?
Um, the main PDF that I sent you will be the primary one we're using. I would have Josephus open in a tab just in case to consult.
Are you going to be like going to like Blue Letter Bible or something like that, some web based thing anytime?
Uh, on a rare occasion potentially, but
Okay.
like
I
very
was
rare.
just wondering if I should share my screen or just the window. So I'm going to share the screen just in case.
Okay.
So this is what you just sent me. Now the one that you no, wait a second.
No,
No,
it
no,
should
that's not the
say,
one.
yeah, it should say complete Esther minus Josephus. There we go.
Oh, okay. So that's it. Now
Yes,
this other one is
you
the old
can
one, right?
you can X that out. Yeah, that's obsolete.
And so what about this one?
Um, that one shows you what my friend did, and I had to fix all that. So that's his initial version. So that was step 1 of the 3-part process.
Do we need to
It
have this?
No, we don't need to have that. It's interesting to see how much I changed of his, but um, we we will look at Old Latin just a little bit, so you can keep that PDF open. Um, I
I'm
guess you
just
can keep that one as well. We might look at like a couple examples, but for the most part, anything that you see here, we can glean from the PDF that I made.
okay.
Um, and I guess if you just have whatever website you like to use for the uh, King James and Brenton.
Okay, so we'll use the
Blue Letter Bible is good, yeah, because we can look at the Hebrew if we need to.
Okay, just gotta zoom out there. All right, so I got that ready. Everything else is ready. Okay.
All right. All right, shalom, guys. We're back once again for going through my version of Esther. Now, remember, I said there's a three-part process. The first part of this three-part process was my friend would go through the different versions, the English translations that already exist, and he would line them up and mark the differences as best as he could. However, he doesn't know Hebrew as well as me, and he also doesn't know as much about uh, textual criticism, or at least scribal work. So he made a lot of errors, but at the same time, I don't fault him too much because I just told him to compare and not to really change things, but just to kind of to just take whatever is in the text and just put them line by line, marking them up and lining them up as best as possible. So that was his part. So part one. The part two is what I have just completed, and that is the initial editing of what he did by me, where I basically fix the errors he made and I alter the words used to be more consistent by consulting the Hebrew and uh, showing how the versions are more closely connected than the translations seem to make it seem, because the translations can make two different translations can make it look like it's a different reading when it's actually just a different translation of the same word. So as much as possible, whenever the text seems to be the same behind the Greek and the Hebrew, I have altered the wording of the witnesses to be identical, to show that they are saying the same thing in the text. So that is what did. That is what I accomplished for this that I'm sharing with you guys today. Part three, step three, which is going to be in the future for me, is I'm going to translate the entire thing myself, fresh, doing a very unique translation that will give you much greater depth than any current translation does. And it'll be more accurate because there are other versions that try to claim they are faithful to the text and unique, but they often don't capture the essence of the Hebrew. So uh, you'll have to wait and see for that. But you guys already got a taste of that when we discussed in a prior lesson or teaching about the example of spirit, I think it was, or soul, was it?
Hmm.
Remember, we compared the Darby version and saw that the Darby version had translated it similarly to how said that the Hebrew reads. So just like that showed a more accurate Hebrew rendering. The same thing's going to happen throughout the entirety of my version when I actually translate it fully myself. But that's going to take a lot more work, so you won't see that anytime soon. But this is, in some ways, this is almost good enough to show you guys what the text says, the differences, and for the most part, translating it myself, while it adds great depth and value to the text, it doesn't radically change the meaning most of the time. So you won't be missing out too much not yet having my translation, uh, but we'll be missing some of the richness and depth of the Hebrew until I am able to produce my version, my translation. But with that said, let's start going through uh, what I have completed here. So we left off, we were on chapter one, and I forget the exact verse we were on, but let's just go to, I'm pretty sure we did at least verse 14. So why don't we go to verse 14 for me?
So that's 1A.
Sorry, it's 1b. that would be maybe in the future I should say page numbers. Page 8.
Okay.
Yeah. So I already mentioned last time that the Septuagint. Oh yeah. Let me first say the differences of the lines. So the first line that you will see in any grouping of 4 or 5 lines, the first line is the Masoretic text. That is the Hebrew text behind the King James Version. And basically almost every English translation. That's the Masoretic text for you. The first line. The second line is from a version called the Alpha text by scholars. The Alpha text only is derived from 4 Greek manuscripts. And that one is a much shorter version of the Book of Esther, but sometimes it agrees with the Septuagint in having extra stuff. And then the third line is the Septuagint proper. That the English translation here comes primarily from the Septuagint version that Brenton did. There's a few differences that I altered some of the wording of Brenton, but for the most part, this is the text, the translation that Brenton made. And the fourth line is the English translation of the Old Latin version. Now, I had briefly mentioned about the Old Latin version of the Bible last time, but I think, if I remember correctly, I didn't complete what I was saying about it. Basically, what I wanted to say about it is that, actually, I think I did, but I'll just say it again. So most of the Old Latin text from the books of the Old Testament have been only preserved in fragments, just kind of like the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Book of Esther is a unique exception. It's one of the only books of the Old Latin that's been preserved fully by a manuscript. Manuscript of Old Latin. So that presents for us an important witness. And also, Esther is, interestingly enough, the only book of the Old Testament so far to be translated from the Old Latin into English. So this is the first English translation of any Old Testament book. So that is significant for studying the Old Latin version, because prior to this, there was no English translation of any book, so it kind of left us at a loss of how different the Old Latin actually is. In some critical textual criticism documents made by scholars, like the Septuagint critical edition called Göttingen, they note Old Latin variants that they say are significant. So a lot of the Old Latin variants, although we don't have an English translation, we can consult in the critical edition of the Göttingen Septuagint. We do also have a version of the Old Latin produced by a scholar like about 2 centuries ago, like 2 centuries ago. So that version is outdated, but it is very valuable for what it presents. But a lot of what he marks as the Old Latin text, he took from quotations of church fathers. So obviously quotations are not on the same level as actual manuscripts, but they're still significant for helping us know the Old Latin text. And yeah, so that's pretty much the basis of how we know the Old Latin readings. But until we get an English translation, we'll have to rely on those critical texts. But luckily, like we said, the Esther book has the English translation of the Old Latin. So that is the fourth line. When you see a fifth line, that is readings from Josephus. In other words, Josephus seems to support that particular reading in what he wrote, because the exact quote of what Josephus said matches a particular reading. So when available, I mark the Josephus variant. Sometimes Josephus summarizes, and it's not clear necessarily which variant he sides with. But in some cases where he quotes verbatim, then the it's quite evident which variant he's siding with. And like I said, unfortunately, was not able to finish the entirety of Josephus, incorporating it into this PDF. It will be done soon, but it was not done in time for tonight. But that's okay, because for the most part, most of the variants are not too important. But there are a few important variants that Josephus does preserve, which I haven't included yet, which we're going to look at later, assuming we have time for that. So, verse 14, we see the only difference in one particular thing is it says 7 princes, whereas the other versions don't say the number 7. Where I said that's the only difference. Obviously, that's not the only difference, but that's the one I wanted to mark there. Wanted to bring to your attention. So the Septuagint only has 3 people, 3 names. The Old Latin has 5 names, so it would make sense that it doesn't say 7 in those 2. Also, the second one, the Alpha text, doesn't even mention the names at all. So it also makes sense why they didn't say 7. But the reading of 7 seems to be more authentic, because you would think that a scribe would be more likely to remove that specification as unnecessary. Now, in the same verse, you see it says, which saw the face of the king, versus the Septuagint and the Old Latin, which say, were near the king. So what we're going to find a lot in the Septuagint is quite often phrases like that, which use physicality, like great detail, are often shortened in the Septuagint translation. This happens a lot throughout the Old Testament, where it'll say in the presence of or in the face of, and it'll be shortened in the Septuagint. Or it'll say by the hand of in the Hebrew text. The Septuagint removes hand. So that happens, like I said, quite a lot. Verse 15, as you can see, the second line doesn't even have it at all. Also in verse 15, it says the commandment of Xerxes the king versus the other 2 versions where it says just the king. So I mentioned last time about if you see a pronoun, like if you see a noun or a name versus in one version versus the other version, which has just a pronoun or just a vague noun, the pronoun or vague noun is more likely to be the original text. So if you have Xerxes the king in one reading versus the king, it's more likely that the original text was the king, and a scribe decided to add Xerxes to clarify which king is being referred to. Whereas the original text by the author, they knew that people would understand that the king was the one that was in the context of the story. But sometimes scribes just try to help the reader by redundantly repeating these details. So remember I just said about the hand thing? Look at that verse, the end of verse 15. The Hebrew text, by the hand of the chamberlains. The Septuagint and Old Latin say by the chamberlains. The meaning is preserved. The same basic meaning is preserved in the translation, the Septuagint and Old Latin, but the faithfulness of the exact wording is preserved in the Masoretic text, the Hebrew text, the hand of the chamberlains. So I think we did do verse 16 last time. I think it was around where we left off. Let's see here.
Yeah, it looks familiar.
Yeah, I think these last couple of verses we had done, but I think right around here is where we left off. So we see once again in verse 17, you have Xerxes the king in line 1, but you have just the king in line 3. But okay, oh yeah, also the squiggly brackets tell you that the text has been rearranged. So this is a little bit confusing in this verse because a lot of stuff has been rearranged. So if you look at the beginning of verse 17, it's the word or the words of the queen. The queen is at the beginning of the verse. But in the Old Latin, it's the king that's at the beginning of the verse. And the queen is mentioned later on in Old Latin. It says, she has been heard by all the women that the queen despised her husband. And Xerxes the king in the first line is like in the middle of the verse, whereas in the Septuagint it's at the very end of the verse. You see, therefore she having refused Artaxerxes the king. Okay, now can you look for me and see what verse 18 says in the actual King James Version? So that's 1:18.
Yeah, sure. So that's chapter 1. Oh, Esther.
Yeah, you just have to say Esther
1:18.
1 and then 18. Yeah. Okay. So that you see right there, the King James Version says the ladies of Persia, but if you click the Hebrew text, yeah, so you're gonna look, and you're gonna see it's the from the right side counting to your left. It's the fourth word, so it's kind of like in the middle of the top line. That word right there is sharot. If I pronounce incorrectly, just ignore it. But so sharot or sarot. So the word for sar or shar, it means prince. The sarah or shara means princess or female prince.
Like Sarah.
Yes, that's actually where her name, why she was named that. And then, and the plural of prince would be sarim, princes, that's masculine, but the plural for feminine would be sharot or sarot. So we see here that's sarot. So instead of ladies, the more accurate translation would be the princesses. So that's why in my version you see princesses in the version that I presented. If you want to go quickly for a second, just for a brief aside based on the whole Sarah thing, if you want to go to where Sarai her name was changed to Sarah. Let's see, name Sarah. Search name Sarah.
Want me to leave this tab open?
No, in this tab, go to verse or words and type name Sarah, and it should bring us to the correct verse. Yeah, so 17:15. So if you click that, it's going to bring us. So now, let's see here. It might be in the next verse, verse 16. So Sarai was renamed Sarah. So let's look at the English translation for a second, right above it. I will bless her and give thee a son also of her. Yea, I will bless her, and she shall be of nations, kings of people shall be of her. Let's see here. Last time I checked this, I thought it said use the word princess or prince somewhere, but I don't see it. So it's possible I'm remembering it incorrectly, but I believe that there's supposed to be a play on words here. It might have been changed from the original text. The original text may have had this play on words. Um, but I don't see it, so you can ignore that. My apologies. But her name comes from princess. So what chapter was that, by the way? Was that 18?
17.
17? Let me just look for a second. Um, let's see. Okay, yeah, so I'll have to do some research on that next time. That might have just been one of my reconstructions that I did. I misremembered it actual text. um, so anyway, go back to our Esther. So remember I talked last time about how there seems to be a letter that once existed where the king actually wrote a full-length letter warning the princes of his kingdom to not let their wives disrespect them, and that wives should obey or respect or submit to their husbands. So that letter probably once existed as part of the Book of Esther, but it was removed by later scribes. Verse 18, the Old Latin has a much longer text where it says, neglecting their husbands and insulting them, or what would prevent the scandal against the king from being repeated also among those who are outside of the kingdom. However, if you look at the beginning of verse 18 or in the middle, there's a shorter text of the Old Latin. See, what prevents also the princesses of Persia and Media, and then all of the next line is not in the text. So that extra thing at the end of the Old Latin is probably a translation of something similar to what the Old Latin is missing in the middle of the verse. They simply just translated it more freely, it looks like. Okay, so verse 19, we have, if it pleases the king, in the first line and the third line. In the second line, if it pleases our Lord, we can basically say our king. It's basically synonymous, Lord, king. So if it pleases our king. And then in the fourth line, the Old Latin, if it pleases you, I need to change that to say thee, because that's the older English correct form. But so if it pleases you or thee, greatest king, and is acceptable to your mind, the first line says from him, third line let him, second line his mind. So now the three witnesses agree with him, but the fourth is the only one that says your instead and you. So what is the original text? Well, something to consider, which might be in favor of the fourth line, is that if you go to the Hebrew text, Blue Letter Bible, for verse 19 of Esther 1, Esther 1:19. Okay, let me see. What am I pointing out here? Okay, so in particular, we're looking at the third word, the third from the right side. So to your left, the third word. So starting from the right, it's the third word. Okay, I know why you did that. So those dashes, ignore those dashes. Pretend those are spaces.
You
So yeah,
mean
so
like this?
so the third word, so that's that one
Okay.
right there. Yeah. I was like, why are you going way over there? I was like, oh yeah, the dashes. So that third word, that says ha malek or e malek. So that word means, often it means the king, but depending on the context, it could mean different things. Sometimes that spelling right there literally can be translated as "O King." That's
Hmm.
called that's what scholars call a vocative. A vocative is a direct address to the individual. So
Is
that's
it
second person.
is this the same as Amalek? Like the name Amalek?
What name would that be? Oh no, no. Are you talking about the nation Amalek
Let me see here.
or the person in the Bible?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's spelled a little differently. If you want, can look it up though.
Now, how do you I forget how to spell it?
Um,
Is it that?
Try that.
No.
It's going to show you in net. I was going to say if you don't know how to spell it, it's telling you
Okay.
go back. Oh yeah, see one result in the net. That's going to tell you which verse it is. Okay, so I don't know if do they have the Hebrew text. You could check that if you want. Okay, where is it? Oh yeah, so it's completely different. So so it's spelled with a ayin and it's spelled with a cough. So it's the first word on the second line on the right side. And you're going to know the first two letters because those are what's called prefixes. So you're only looking at the last four letters. So so you see the M and the L there are the
Hmm.
same, but the last letter and the first letter, the ayin, those are different. So yeah, it's not related, even though the English may make it look like it's the same. But yes, you can go back to where we were. Um,
Because the way you pronounce that, the one way you pronounce it sounded like that. Amalek?
yeah.
Yeah.
Um, okay. So, and sometimes that's where some of the scribal errors come from, is because scribes are copying by their hearing. They're listening to the words being read out, and they hear something incorrectly, or they're just copying and they say it in their head, and
Mm.
and when they say it in their head, they're hearing it in their head, and then they hear the wrong word. So that actually happens often, but in the scribes, in the manuscripts as well. But so that letter, the first letter, hey, it can mean um, it can mean the king in this context. So hey would mean the. Um, Ignoring the words before and after, depending what the sentence was, it could be a question mark. Hey also marks a question. At the beginning of a clause, hey will tell you that it's a question that's about to come. Hey will also tell you, like I said, oh, like you're addressing someone directly. So that's imperative or second person. You, uh, oh king, and it also can mean cause to rule. So if if you vote, let's say you vote for someone to become president, um, and they're elected, you cause them to rule or become ruler or to become king. So if you were going to say in a sentence, he caused him to rule, or he caused to rule him, uh, you would say hey at the beginning of the word for melech, because melech can mean king or can mean rule as a verb, to rule over something. So, but in this sentence, it means the king, it seems. But what if in the original text it actually meant O king, because it's spelled the same? Well, now you have a dilemma where the scribes copying, it says either the king or O king, and they're not sure which it means. So the scribes who think it means the king change the text to make it agree with third person pronouns later on. But the original text may have been second person, uh, as we see. in the fourth line. So if you go back to my PDF, the fourth line says you and your mind. It's very plausible that the original said, O king, and thus it would have had you and your, but later scribes thought it said the king, and so they're like, okay, well, the king versus you and your, we want to make it consistent, so they changed you and your to him, and to king, and just removed the you. Okay, so now so at the end of verse 19, you have Vashti in the first version, Vashti, just Vashti in the second. Then in the Septuagint, it says just the queen. And in the fourth line, it says Vashti, the queen. So the Old Latin seems to have compared the Hebrew and the Septuagint and combined them together. Josephus seems to just agree with just the Vashti reading, because that's the fifth line. But it's very plausible that the original text here was she. Because the queen was already mentioned in a prior verse. So by context, we already know who it's being talked about. Who is the she? The one that was already should be. It's possible I might need to get a drink in a second. So the original text may have said she, and scribes often would add a detail to explain who they think it's talking about. So the Masoretic text added Vashti, the name, whereas the Septuagint simply thought it was sufficient to say the queen. And then the Old Latin saw the two different versions, wasn't sure which is the correct version, and so it combined it. Okay.
If you want to get yourself a glass of water, I can read a few people in the chat here.
I might do that. Just 1 second here. Let's see, was that verse 19? I'm looking here. Sorry, 1 second here. Okay. So if you want, go to the Hebrew text of 119.
Okay.
So that the last line, the first word. So that's two, and then they translate it. What do they translate it as? Up above? Unto another that is better. Or so unto another is how they translate it. But if you actually go to the Hebrew text there, if you click on that word, it's gonna bring you up to a Strong's number. So if you go to it, it comes from neighbor or friend, and then if you, but it's the feminine version. So if you go and click, let's see. Actually, I don't know if it's going to show it. Oh yeah, click the one that says 7453. It's at the top. 7453. If you click it. Yeah. So we take a look there and look at how it's translated. It's translated 102 times as neighbor, 42 times as friend, another as 23 times, fellow 10 times, companion 5 times. Okay, and then you see brother, husband. So in all these cases, really what it basically means is a companion, or so a neighbor is basically a synonym of companion. So that's what a friend is. A friend is your companion. So it's another is a very, in my opinion, it's not a good translation. So if you look in my version, if you go back to my PDF, I do not say unto another. I alter it to say a female companion. And the reason I do that is because the Septuagint says woman. So if you're for comparison purposes, you have the one version saying another, and then the other version says woman. It's like, whoa, that looks like it's a completely different reading. Well, if the actual text says female companion, or companion, female gender, you can see why the Septuagint scribe, translates it as woman, because a woman is a female companion. Okay. Then, interestingly, at the end of verse 20, for some reason, the Hebrew text says great and small in that order, but all three other versions say it in the opposite order. They translate it as poor and rich, but it's clearly connected to the same verb or adjectives, or the words or whatever, the nouns. So great corresponds with rich, small corresponds with poor, but they're in reversed order for some reason. So it's not clear why the scribes would alter the order. So because of the three versions, there is good reason to suspect that this other order might be correct, but we don't know 100% for sure. Verse 21. This is another example of where I talked about the fuller physicality is watered down in the Septuagint version. So the word was pleasing in the eyes of the king and the princes. The second line basically says the same thing, except it says in the heart of the king. That's clearly a translation of the same text. But the Septuagint says the word pleased the king. It does not say in the eyes of, but it means the same basic thing. But the scribe that translated it was like, this is unnecessary, we don't need it, so they removed it. So again, this happens quite a lot. We see at the end of 21, the king did according to, versus he did according to. So like I said, he, much of the time when you have that, he is probably more likely to be correct, but I wouldn't say 100% that's the case. But there's a good likelihood that he is the more correct reading. Even though the other three say the king, because a pronoun is used, it's more probable to be correct. And then, of course, we have Memucan, the name, versus Muke in the Septuagint, and Old Latin absurdly says Mordecai. Clearly, the Old Latin there is wrong. Verse 22 is completely missing in the second line. But that's because, again, remember how I told you the whole fact that there might have been an original letter was removed by the scribes for being unnecessary? Well, it looks like this even happened for the summary, because in verse 22, for the second line, they didn't want to mention it. They didn't want to talk about the letter being sent because they thought it was unnecessary. Who cares about that letter? So they just ignored that line. We also see that the unto every province according to the writing thereof, and unto every people according to its language. So you see how it's a shorter text, like in the Septuagint, third line and the fourth line, they shorten it significantly because it's repetitive. So it's preserving the same basic thing. To show you that they consistently do the same thing at the same type of statement later on, I want you to go to the page. Let's see here. What page is it? It's in chapter 9, I believe. Or possibly chapter 8. Actually, I think it's actually chapter 8. Yeah. Let's see. One second here. I'm just trying to show the parallel where they clearly shorten the text. Yeah, so it is on page 63. So we're going to see that the first compared to the third line. Verse 9. First line compared to the third line. Page 63. To every province accordingly, or according, the first line, to the writing thereof, and to every people after their language, and to the Jews according to their writing and according to their language. The Septuagint shortens it to say, to every province accordingly after their dialects. Because notice the text says, according to every province, every people, and also to the Jews. Well, Jews are people, right? So the scribes were like, well, people, it's already included. So it's kind of redundant. So you can see why they removed the second statement, because it's basically saying the same thing, except it's saying the Jews are included in this statement. But that's a clear example of the same type of thing. It's the same language being used. Every province, according to the writing thereof, to every people. It's just shortened in the Septuagint, just for condensing it as being unnecessary detail. So the Septuagint does this very often in books of the Old Testament. Let's see here. So we were on page 11. Interestingly, the Old Latin, the fourth line, is the only one that says a great fear arose in every woman. For some reason, that version adds that text. It's not clear if that's original or if that's just a commentary a scribe added. So now we go to chapter 2. Once again, we have an example of Xerxes the king versus the king. And like I've said before, it's more likely the king is more likely to be correct than Xerxes the king. And that's supported by the fact that two versions agree with the same. Let's see. Okay. Now the reason that's just squiggly lines is because that phrase, Xerxes the king or the king, is found in the second line but way later. It's found later on in verse 1. See at the end of verse 1, what she had done to Xerxes the king. So verse 3, line 3 is completely missing. At least the first half, anyway. A small difference, but you have his kingdom versus for the Old Latin, the kingdom. But Septuagint and the Masoretic agreeing with his, that's probably the correct reading, his. Oh, and by the way, sometimes, like in different manuscripts, you'll see and is in different spots. I believe that's because most of the time, most of the ands are not part of the original text. Ands were added, ands were basically used as the ancient people's way of using punctuation. They used ands almost like commas. So if they thought a comma should be put somewhere, they would put an and there. But if they thought the comma shouldn't be put there, they would not have the and there. So in the original text, there were much fewer ands, but ands were inserted into the Hebrew text in different versions where they thought the and was where they thought the sentence began and started. So that's why you sometimes see differences in translations that seem to be wildly different, because and was being inserted into different places. Remember again that the names of the people are butchered in the other versions. So Haggai is the correct name, but the second line says Gegai. The third line doesn't even have the name, which is unlikely because this guy has not been introduced yet. So we need to know who his name is. So it's more likely correct that the name was introduced here. The chamberlain of the king, the guard of the woman. Okay, let's see.
All right.
What's
Something
up?
happened there. I'm not sure what happened.
Did I get kicked off?
I'm not sure what happened there. All of a sudden, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Not sure what happened there. All of a sudden, it just seemed like lost internet connection here, I think it was.
Okay. How long did that last?
Uh, it's been what, about 3 minutes, maybe? Maybe about 2 or 3 minutes.
So the whole time I was talking, it was not going
Yeah,
through,
I
or
guess.
or or did it go through? I don't know.
Um, yeah, I don't know what happened.
Can you guys say in the comments, did was there like a 3 minute or like a long delay where nothing was happening, or did you guys hear me? Let me know. But okay, so apparently it did go through, so that is good. Erland Clement says that it came through. All right,
Okay.
great.
Must have been just me then.
Okay,
Uh,
that's good. Maybe if we're both on live, my connection is enough to continue the live or something. I don't know.
Maybe. And for the
Um,
for those of you who submitted comments or anything before this just happened, I can't post it, but just while we're here anyway, I see Cat Cool says Shabbat Shalom. Total Torah says Shabbat Shalom. Vita says Shabbat Shalom all. Elohim bless you all. Billy says Shalom. Erlin says Shabbat Shalom. Long time no see. Yes, long time no see. Happy to see you all again, my brothers and sisters. Happy to see you as well, and happy to see all of you. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Blessings multiplied to each of you. Sorry, not sure what happened there with the connection. Have no idea what happened. So hopefully that won't happen again.
yeah, sorry you missed some of it. It was probably nothing too special though.
Okay.
Um, but just a couple questions here. Um, does the Septuagint therefore take away from what it was saying? Um, I don't. Oh, I think it's connected. That might be connected to the is the word nations instead of people, and the Jews aren't counted in the nations. Um, so I think sometimes Jews are counted as part of the nations, and sometimes they're not. Like it's kind of like how we might say like and the other groups. But instead of saying the word other, they just say uh, they just say instead of saying other, they just say the word. So I don't think the Septuagint in that instance is altering the message. I don't think. Um, but the Septuagint, like I said, the Septuagint does that a lot. But sometimes the Hebrew text does that, and the Septuagint preserves the original full text. Interestingly enough. So, anyways, let's go back to the PDF. So we're on page 12. What was the last thing you heard me say, Christopher?
You're talking about the king, Xerxes the king, versus you're saying about how that's typical. Um,
Oh, the Xerxes the king versus the king.
yeah.
And then I mentioned how the squiggly lines uh, are there because the same phrase, Xerxes the king, is at the end of verse 1 in the second line. It's that same phrase, but it's at the end of, so that's why there's the squiggly lines there.
Okay.
And then, um, and then I went to verse 3 and I said the second line is missing the first half entirely. And let's see here. So you see it says the good appearing young virgins in the first and third line, whereas the old line just says the good virgins. So it's unlikely that, the original text said the good virgins, and then the scribe was like, no, they're good appearing young virgins. We got to change that. So it was more likely to be the full text was the original, and it was shortened by the Old Latin just because it was unnecessary to say it fully out. And then I mentioned how Haggai, the name Haggai, is in the first and fourth. The Septuagint does not have the name here, which is not likely to be correct because this is the first time this guy's being introduced to us, so you would think the name would be included. And the second line has the name spelled incorrectly because, as we said, the versions notoriously get names badly. Let's see. Verse 4, you're going to see it's the translation in the Septuagint and the Masoretic says thing, but the Old Latin, the fourth line, says word. So, interestingly enough, the Hebrew word for thing and word is the same word. It's dabar. And so, depending on context, it can be translated as thing or word. And then we have he versus they. He did so versus they did so. He seems to be the more correct reading. It has the three versions that all agree with it. And let's see here. Okay, so verse 5, it says, in Shushan there was a Jewish man. The Old Latin does not specify that he was Jewish, but all the other versions do, including Josephus. So that detail is pretty confident. And then the genealogy is specified in the three versions. It's not specified in the Old Latin version. So the Old Latin is unlikely to be correct. Now we talked about in verse 6 how we can compare the different versions that appear elsewhere in the same book to see which variants are correct. Because remember, in chapter 1a, this same basic passage occurs there. And we noted last time that in that place there was one version that did not say from Jerusalem. Well, when we saw this verse 6, the words from Jerusalem are in this verse in all the other versions. So that suggests that in 1a, the same passage in 1a, the from Jerusalem reading is the more accurate reading. Now, this is an interesting one. Looks like I forgot to mark this, but in verse 7, so we have the daughter. So Hadassah, or Esther, is regarded in the Septuagint version as the daughter of Aminadab. But it's a completely different name in the Hebrew text. And the Hebrew text is the correct reading. The Septuagint makes up a name for some reason. It would be Abinadab. So my father Nadab, Abinadab. But the actual text of the Hebrew says Abihail, and the Abihail is the correct reading, not Abinadab. And remember, like I said, the readings are the names in particular of the Septuagint are unreliable. So let's see here. So look, for she had neither father nor mother. The second line in the Septuagint do not have that text. But um, let's see. But the fourth line, the Old Latin, it has the same basic text except it's condensed. She had neither father nor mother. That's rendered as she was an orphan, because that's by definition not having a father or mother. So instead of translating the full phrase, they just shortened it to say, they summarized it or condensed it to say she was an orphan. But clearly it's translating the same text there. Let's see. Okay, so you notice you'll notice some squiggly lines here. And so, for example, Hadassah, that is Esther, and her name was Esther. So saying Esther in the first three versions, three lines, Esther is mentioned in the middle of the verse. But in the fourth line, that clause, and her name was Esther, is at the very end of the verse. So a slight arranging of that clause. Also, beautiful in appearance, the maiden was fair in form and beautiful in appearance. That clause, compared to the Septuagint line, the Septuagint line puts that clause at the very end of the verse. You could see at the very end, and the maiden was beautiful. That's clear corresponding to the same phrase earlier in the verse in the other versions. But what's interesting is, like I said, the fuller text, fair in form and beautiful in appearance. The Septuagint shortens that significantly and just says the maiden was beautiful. Because fair in form and beautiful in appearance, that's a lot of words to say that she's beautiful. You could just say she's beautiful, and that conveys the meaning. But the Hebrew text wants to be more poetic and say the full thing. The Septuagint, as a translation, deems that as unnecessary repetition and simply shortens it to say, maiden was beautiful. Once again, we have a shortened thing where we see, when her father and mother were dead. The other versions, including Josephus, say, when her parents were dead. Now, also, a strange thing occurs at the very end where it says, in the Masoretic and in Josephus and in the Old Latin, it says, he took her for his own daughter. Oh, and I guess I didn't mark this correctly, but no, wait, never mind. I did mark it correctly. I was going to say the second line. See where it says at the beginning of verse 7, and Mordecai fostered her as his own daughter. I was going to say that that's part of the second line, but obviously it's the fourth line. So that kind of repeats the statement that the Old Latin version repeats it twice, that Mordecai took her as his own daughter. But the Septuagint version bizarrely says took her for his own wife. So the question becomes, was Esther the daughter of Mordecai or the wife of Mordecai? What complicates it further is the Talmud agrees with the Septuagint, even though the Hebrew text of the Jews says daughter, the Talmud says that she was his wife. So what's going on here? Well, actually, I have something very interesting to share with you guys from the New Testament. I'm going to have you open. Can you open Bible Gateway for me now?
Sure.
Let's see here. Okay. So let's take a look here. I want you to go to the version 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 36 to 38. (36 to 38). Yeah. All right, so I'm going to anyone is that he might not be acting honorably toward the virgin he is engaged to, and if his passions are too strong and he feels he ought to marry, he should do as he wants. He is not sinning. They should get married. But the man who has settled the matter in his own mind, who is under no compulsion but has control over his own will, and who has made up his mind not to marry the virgin, this man also does the right thing. So then he who marries the virgin does right, but he who does not marry her does better. Now notice there's a footnote there. Let's click that footnote. Say, or they say it could be translated as, if anyone thinks he is not treating his daughter properly, and if she is getting along in years, or if her passions are too strong, and he feels she ought to marry, he should do as he wants. He is not sinning. He should let her get married. But the man who has settled the matter in his own mind, who's under no compulsion but has control over his own will, and who has made up his mind to keep the virgin unmarried, this man also does the right thing. So then he who gives his virgin in marriage does right, but he who does not give her in marriage does better. So interestingly, the one translation that the NIV provides translates it as a woman he's marrying or his wife. But they say it could also be translated to refer to his daughter. Now, obviously, it's a Greek text, this text. And if you look at the Hebrew, the Hebrew word used is daughter. But I think that this is a very interesting coincidence, the confusion between wife and daughter. There might be something similar going on here, which could be the reason for the difference between the two versions. Perhaps the original text didn't say, maybe it didn't say daughter or wife. Maybe the original text said he took her for his own maiden. His own maiden. So maiden could be, a daughter, or it could be a wife potentially. So the one version, the Masoretic, interprets it as daughter, and the Septuagint interprets it as wife. So that could be the explanation for the variant there, because it seems weird that the Septuagint would be like, so Mordecai took her for his own daughter. Nah, let's change that to wife. So, and also you would think if the original text said wife, it would seem strange for a scribe to change it to say daughter. It doesn't really make sense. So that's my theory to explain why we see this. Now, verse 8, the second line is missing for the first half again. Notice beginning of verse 8, the Septuagint once again condenses the phrase. So the king's commandment and his decree were heard. The Septuagint says the king's decree was heard. It doesn't say king's commandment and his decree. Commandment, decree, it basically means the same thing, so they just shortened it to say decree. The Septuagint, remember we said the names are bad, so the name is Haggai, but it should say, Septuagint says Guy. It does not say Hey. And let me look at the reason for that. That's Esther 2. Hold on. Yeah, so can you go to 2 verse 8 for us in the Hebrew? Sorry, in the Blue Letter Bible Hebrew. So we're going to go to Haggai. Yeah, so see at the very end the third word from the left side. So if you go from the left side in the bottom line, the third line, that one right there. So the name is Haggai. The Septuagint seems to interpret that as the guy. So that first letter again is Hey, which means the. So the Septuagint seems to transliterate it as if it's like a proper noun. Like, you know how we say Elohim? That just means God, right? But people transliterate Elohim in our English translations. Septuagint does sometimes similar things for other names. They will transliterate special nouns. Like for example, we say cherubim, right? That's a transliteration, cherubim. So the Septuagint seems to have interpreted it not as a name, but as some noun. Apparently, they thought maybe guy or gi was a noun that meant something. They didn't know what it meant, so they just transliterated it and they rendered it as the guy. That would be my explanation for why it says why they dropped the hey, because they didn't realize it was part of the name. And we're going to see in other places that they mess up the name terribly. In fact, I want to show you guys right now because it's actually quite hilarious. Could you go to page 73 for a second? And okay. So take a look at verse 7. So the names are quite different, right? But what's very funny is the first line and the third line says Dalphon. That name is the correct name. But the second line says his brother. So Christopher, do you know Greek enough to know why that's funny?
I know that brother. What's it? What is it? It's got that Phil. Is it? It's not. The Greek word for brother is similar to the ph. What is it? Something else. I don't know that.
Yeah. So let's look that up. Going to be in. We'll find it in. I guess I can just. I guess I can just go to. So, well, I guess you can go to Blue Letter Bible, just search brother, and go to a New Testament verse or something, and then you can click on that text, just so people can see, because it's just quite funny.
So it's this one here, Adelphon.
Yes, Adelphon. So, so the name, the Hebrew name, is Dalphon, and the second line messed it up and changed it from a name to a Greek word, Adelphon.
I see.
It's kind of a similar thing to what we talked about with uh, law versus name in the Greek.
Imagine
You know
doing that
how,
with everybody today, like actually actually translating their names instead of calling them by their name.
yeah. But it's just funny that because it's a Hebrew word or Hebrew name, although it's not Hebrew, it's Persian, but it's from a Hebrew text transliterated into Greek, and then a later copy miscopied it, and so the later scribes misread it as the word Adelphon, brother. So that's just kind of a little comical thing. But that was not the Septuagint. That was the Alpha text. Okay. So now we go back to line, or excuse me, page 14. Now remember, I told you guys that the original text, instead of daughter or wife, maybe it said maiden. Remember I said that? Well, interestingly enough, you have in verse 8, three versions say Esther, but one version says maiden instead of Esther. So that's kind of a interesting variant there. And then go up a little bit to verse 8. So fifth line, uh, the first, third, and fourth line say many maidens. Many maidens were gathered for the king. But Josephus says that there was 400 maidens. Where does Josephus get this number? We don't know. But I included that as a variant because that's a very peculiar. No other witness says that, but Josephus seems very confident that there were 400 in number. So that could be part of the original text. The second line butchers the name of Haggai and says Bugai. Bugai. Okay, let's see here. So verse 9, you have the maiden versus the second line, she. Okay. And then it's actually quite interesting. So verse 9, the first occurrence says she, and the second occurrence says Esther. So in that, she pleased him, Esther obtained. But the first and third line says maiden pleased, she obtained. So it's like the she switches places. It's kind of weird.
Yeah. Could you give me a few minutes, sir?
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, hold on.
Yeah, so Phoenix Food Dude says the original Septuagint was the Torah only. That is correct. However, later on, there were other Greek translations done. And we'll keep in mind that the Greek translations were made of alternate Hebrew texts. They are not the same Hebrew text of the Masoretic. So even though the original Septuagint was just the Pentateuch, the 5 books, the other books were translated soon after that. Not at the same place, but they were later translated within the same century, same 100 years after. And that is before the Messiah was born. So before the Messiah was born, the original, what we would call the Septuagint, or the original Greek translation of the Old Testament existed. And when I say the original translation, obviously each book was probably translated by different people. But so the original translation of each book already existed before the Messiah was born. and they were based on Hebrew texts that often differed quite substantially from our Hebrew text that we're familiar with, uh, the Masoretic text. So hopefully he'll be back soon. I should have taken credit for the piano playing. That I should have taken credit for that. I used to play piano, but I am I was not too good at it. I was okay, but kind of like beginning, still a beginner still, and I haven't done it in like over like almost like, I don't know 15 years or something. But I'd love to get back into music sometime because music brings out some amazing things. But so while we wait, um, so if any of you guys are interested in oh, never mind, he's back. I was just going to say, for those who like this version, this PDF file, I would be happy to share it with you guys. Although, like I said, it's only step 2 of the 3-part process. So the better version of this will be out in the future. So if you want to wait for the full version, that's probably better to wait. But anyways, are you back and ready, Christopher?
I'm ready.
All right, awesome. Um, so okay. Now, verse 10, Esther showed not her people nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her that she should not show. So that does not mention God at all, right? Well, there's a similar statement later on that does mention God in one version or a couple versions, uh, but it is possible that the original text there agreed with the no mention of God, just as it is here. But we'll get to that in a little bit. Um, okay, so now we've got. So remember I said the ands? The ands are what throw things off sometimes and make it look like things are different places, but they're actually not. So notice in verse 11, to know how Esther fared and what should become of her. So in line 1 and line 4, Esther is in the prior clause. It's in the fared clause. It's before and. But in the third line, the Septuagint, Esther is at the very end. So so this could just be the Septuagint summarizing or condensing, which actually I would say in this particular case that could be it. That's probably what it is. But alternatively, you could also make the case that the original text maybe didn't have "and" there, so it would have said something like, to know how Esther fared. I don't even know how you would translate that without "and," but yeah. So anyway, there are other instances that are better than that, where you can it looks like the Hebrew text might be different because it's in a different order, but if you remove "and," then you could line it up as the same text. I'll have to just, if I ever find an example like that for you guys, I'll share it. Okay, verse 12. Once again, we have Xerxes versus Xerxes the king. Now, I made the claim before that the king is more likely to be the correct than Xerxes the king. Someone might say against that, though, that I've shown so many times the Septuagint is condensing the text. So couldn't it be argued that Xerxes the king is being condensed to just the king? I say that could be argued that, but it seems unlikely to condense a name to a noun, to an ambiguous noun. A name and a noun being condensed. So I am inclined to think that Xerxes was added. Okay. So I think I had difficulties translating or rendering this, and this happens a lot in the book. So if we go to Esther 2 in the Hebrew tab, 212, King James Version is going to say, now when. Now when. But let's take a look at the Hebrew text. What does it say? Difficultly, it's the first word on the right side. And so the actual text says, and in, or and by. But when you translate it literally like that, it makes it sound weird. So they translate it as when to make it sound better. Let's see. Because if you go to, let's see. One second here. Sometimes it's not in this case, but sometimes it'll say that, and the translation will say that, but the actual Hebrew text will say and. But anyways, we can go back to the PDF file. Okay, so the description for the anointing, there's different orders, as you can see. There's a lot of squigglies. So you have oil of myrrh and first, and sweet odors with purifications of the woman as the second. For the first, so for Masoretic and Septuagint, that's the reading. Sweet odors is rendered as perfumes in the Septuagint. That's a synonym. But in the fourth line, Old Latin, the sweet odors and purifications of the woman come first, for some, and then the second is with oil of myrrh. So with sweet odors and with purification of the woman is seen. The scribe seems to view that as part of the same grouping. So that occurred in the same 6 months, and for some reason, Old Latin version lists it first. Verse 13, you have maiden versus she. So she is probably more likely to be correct. She is found in the Septuagint and the Old Latin. Maiden is in the Masoretic. And then the second line says Esther. Now you're going to see there it says CF16. So hold on a second. I think I need to fix this in my version. Wait, hold on. Esther was. Oh no, I understand now. So this is not even being this is not being compared with verse 13. So in the second version, the alpha text, see that phrase, and when Esther was taken unto the king, she was very pleasing to him. That doesn't correspond at all with the other three versions. That's because this line comes later on in the other versions. It comes in verse 16. So if you go to verse 16, page 16, verse 16, page 16, it says the same thing. And Esther was taken unto Xerxes the king, or unto the king. And though it's in marked in squigglies to tell you. So then you see CF13, that's bringing you back to that same verse that we were just at. So we're going to see that occasionally. Now, okay, verse 13, the first line, it says, she command, all which she commands. The Septuagint says, all which he commands. And then the first line, her to go with her, Septuagint, her to go with him. So a unique variant there for the pronoun. Now I need to fix some of this. Looks like never mind. I keep getting confused by that second line that says CF16. That keeps confusing me. Okay. Okay, and now we have an example of the Old Latin condensing the text. So, in the evening she goes, and in the morning she returns. The Old Latin renders it as for a single day. Well, evening and morning, evening and the morning was a day, Genesis says. So, the Old Latin just condenses it to say a single day. Now, strangely, the Septuagint, so the Masoretic text correctly says the name Shashgaz or Shaashgaz. The Septuagint says Guy, as if they thought it was like the like a name or something, or not a name, like a noun, a special noun of an individual. It doesn't make sense why they say Guy here when it says Shaashgaz. So, but clearly the Septuagint is an error there. Okay. Okay, verse 15. Here we see the name of Esther's father in the Old Latin and the Masoretic. It's Abihail. The Septuagint incorrectly says Aminadab. And then the Septuagint and Old Latin just say the uncle of Mordecai, or Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, to go. So when the time was come for Esther to go, but the Masoretic says Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her for his daughter to go. So the Masoretic text adds that detail, even though we already saw that detail earlier on in the chapter. It mentions that he took her for his daughter. So it's possible that fuller text of the Masoretic is original, but I do like the shorter text of the Septuagint just because it doesn't make sense to explain it to us again. We were already told the relation earlier on. They already explained to us that he took her for his daughter. So it doesn't make sense for them to clarify that again. The only reason you would clarify that is if someone was reading and they thought maybe this is a different Mordecai, because there was more. Mordecai wasn't the only person named Mordecai. We have evidence outside the Bible of other people being named Mordecai. So, so the scribe probably wanted to clarify and say Mordecai, the one who had taken her for his daughter. But so probably that clarification was not in the original text, because, like I said, that was already clarified earlier on. So we don't need it to be clarified every time Mordecai is mentioned. So interestingly, the Old Latin says, the only one that says, she went unto the king, and it was when she went unto the king. So that's a whole extra clause there. Doesn't really change the meaning, but interesting how the other versions don't have it at all. So now we have Haggai, king's chamberlain. But the other versions just say the chamberlain. It doesn't say the name. However, he was already introduced earlier. Haggai was introduced to us already. So it is quite possible that the Septuagint is the correct reading, because we don't need to know his name anymore because we were already told his name. Okay. Esther obtained favor. Then the second line says, she was very pleasing to him. Okay, let's see here. Okay, the Masoretic text says, in the 10th month, which is the month Tebet, in the 7th year of his reign. The other versions say Adar. Bizarrely, it says Adar. I need to mark this. Apparently, I forgot to mark off that Josephus reading for the 5th line. But so we have year, the 7th year versus the 4th line, Old Latin. It says the month, 7th month. The year reading is clearly correct. And also, strangely, the mass, in multiple places throughout this Book of Esther, the Hebrew says a different month name. The Septuagint always changed it to say Adar. Always. For some reason, they always change it to Adar. And it really doesn't make sense why. But so the Hebrew text correctly preserves the different month names. And then the 10th month is the correct, but they changed it to the 12th month for some reason. And we're going to see later on that they seem to be confusing this with the whole story of when they were to be killed in the 12th month of Adar. So the scribes seem to be confusing that. Okay, verse 17. She obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins. The Septuagint shortens it to say she obtained favor more than all the virgins. So you can see, once again, they're removing in his sight, and also grace and favor is just shortened to favor. So consistently, the Septuagint is shortening the text for for briefer descriptions, which mean the same thing. But so the fuller descriptions of the Hebrew text are more authentic. It says CR and I don't know what that's about. That must be a typo. I'll have to fix that, or figure out why that says that. But okay, the phrase "and made her queen instead of Vashti," it's only in the Masoretic and the Old Latin. The Septuagint and the Alpha text do not have it. So now, interestingly, we've got consistently when the Masoretic says princes, usually the Septuagint will say friends, which I render as companions. I don't know why that is. I view the friends reading or the companions reading to be inferior. The princes reading should be more correct. Now, the Septuagint says the feast was for 7 days. The mention of days is not mentioned at all in the other versions, Masoretic and the Alpha text. But interestingly enough, Josephus says a similar statement, but instead of 7 days, he says it was 30 days. So that's quite a different reading there. It's not clear where Josephus got that, and 30 is quite different from 7. So why, if it was 30, did it get changed to 7? Or vice versa. If it was 7, why was it changed to 30? So that's a little bit confusing for that variant there. Okay, remember I said Esther had not showed her kindred nor her people? And I said there was a similar statement, but it mentions God in that similar statement. Here is where it is. Verse 20. So now take a look at this. So verse 20. Esther had not showed her kindred nor her people, as Mordecai had charged her. For Esther did Mordecai's commandment, as when she was brought up with him. Now the Septuagint says, as Mordecai had charged her to fear God and do his commandments, as when she was with him. And Esther changed not her manner of life. The Old Latin text says, as Mordecai had charged her in order to comply with everything, as when she was with him, and to fear God every day. So both the Old Latin and Septuagint add the detail like that Mordecai commanded her to fear God and to do his commandments. So the question is, did the original text say God or was it added? So there's two possibilities. One is that, remember I said there was a full letter at the end in chapter 9 that once existed? So maybe this detail to fear God comes from there. But I'm inclined to think that the correct explanation here is that, see where it says in Septuagint, do his commandments, versus the Masoretic did Mordecai's commandments. So I think it should say, as Mordecai had charged her, for Esther did his commandment, as when she was brought up with him. So the original text said his. So the Septuagint was like, who's his talking about? That must be talking about God. So they interpreted it as referring to God instead of Mordecai. And so they added to fear God. Alternatively, it could have said to fear the Lord, and maybe the Lord was referring to Mordecai, and Mordecai being Esther's Lord, because men were considered the lords of their women, of the daughters, or of their wives. So, however, because the Masoretic consistently does not mention God, it's more probable that to fear God was added. And like I said, it's simply because his is probably authentic. So the original text is probably the Septuagint for did his commandments. So not Mordecai's commandment, but his commandment is the original text. But to fear God is added. That is my explanation for that. And then she changed not her manner of life. I would argue that is authentic and not an addition, because it doesn't explicitly say anything about religion. So I personally think that is authentic, that variant, and that the Masoretic removed it for some reason. We talked about this last time, the name differences. So Bigthan and Teresh is the correct names, but the Old Latin says Berthag and Tadesh. Tadesh being due to the scribal error, confusing the letters Dalet with Resh. Can you go to Google for a second? Lexilogos Hebrew. Lexilogos Hebrew. Okay, so it should say Lexilogos Hebrew, like type both words, yeah. Okay, so it's that first one right there. So I want you to type just the letter R, and we'll see what it looks like. Okay, now do a space. I'm sorry, do enter. Do D, the letter D. Okay, so now you see they look similar, but in online they look different, right? Because they're clearly marked differently. But when scribes were writing it, they wrote it much closer to each other. So those letters are confused all the time in manuscripts. And so many of the variants between the Septuagint and the Masoretic are due to this confusion right here. So keep that in mind when you're comparing versions of different books of the Old Testament. Okay, so back to the PDF. We got Bigtha and Tadesh, Gibtha and Terah, and then Ashta. So those are all the variants for the names, but the only ones correct are Bigthan and Teresh. Let's see here. Okay, so two of the king's chamberlains from the guards of the door were wroth. The Septuagint says they were grieved because Mordecai was promoted, but that is wrong. That is inaccurate. That was added. Misinterpretation. Because it had nothing to do with Mordecai being promoted. That happens later in the story. So then, like I said, Josephus adds a detail not in any other version, which says, and Barnabas, a Jewish servant of one of the chamberlains, learned of their conspiracy and made it known to Mordecai. So Josephus tells us that Barnabas was the one who heard it, and he reported it to Mordecai. Whereas all the other versions imply that Mordecai found out about it, but they didn't tell us how he found out about it. Okay. You know how I said, again, the name versus the pronoun? Masoretic says Esther in verse 22. Septuagint says she. Okay. Okay, so now we go to 3a. So that's page 18. We see Haman, the son of Hammedatha. Now note that he's being introduced now for the first time. So now we do not need to keep being introduced to his name throughout the book. So when we see it keep being introduced, that's unlikely to be authentic. It's likely to be a later addition. So Haman, the son of Hammedatha. The son of Hammedatha is original in this place because we need to know who he is. The Agagite. The Septuagint, for some reason, translates it as Bugian. Other times, you'll see a translation Macedonian. So they interpret the Agagite as a reference to the Macedonians for some reason. I don't know how accurate that is. I don't know how accurate their interpretation is, but that's what the Septuagint interprets it as. So once, remember I told you princes were often, the mention of princes is often rendered as companions or friends in Septuagint. So once again, we see that here in verse 1. Okay. So here we have reverenced Haman in the Masoretic text, verse 2, versus reverenced him. Again, I believe him is the correct reading. The second line adds, and the king's, for verse 3, and the king's servants saw that Mordecai did not reverence before Haman. None of the other versions have that, interestingly. The king's servants in the Masoretic text, but Septuagint says they. So again, pronoun more likely to be authentic because the king's servants was already mentioned in verse 2, in the beginning of verse 2. So they don't need to say the king's servants again. But a scribe might alter it to say the king's servants to clarify who they is, because it could be that it's a different they. So they is added for clarification. The king's servants is added for clarification to the original they. Septuagint says, said to Mordecai, Mordecai, why transgressest thou the king's commandments? The original text probably did not say Mordecai, like 2 times. It just said it the 1 time. In my PDF, you see my quotes are around why. It should be around the second Mordecai. So that's a typo I got to fix. You multiple times throughout this document, we're going to see that the Hebrew has a singular and the Septuagint will have a plural. That often happens. Another example is hand. Masoretic will say hand. Sometimes the Septuagint will say hands instead of hand. The reason for that is because plural makes more sense in other languages. So they translate it as plural just for it to make more sense in their language. Okay, let's see here. The 4th verse, it says, Mordecai does not obey the king so as to honor thee. There we have a direct reference to the second person, directly to the king, whereas the other ones are not even, they're not even being, it's not even in quotes. It's just a statement. So it's not clear here which is the original text because it may have been altered in the 4th line because they thought it was a speech being said. So depending on if you interpret the text as being spoken or as a statement about the situation will determine how you interpret the sentence. So because they interpreted it as words being spoken, they probably changed it to say thee, if I had to guess. The Josephus adds at the end of verse 4, and Haman said to himself, though the Persians bow before me, this vassal refuses to do so. That's not in any other version, but Josephus quotes that dialogue. So Masoretic says, Mordecai bowed not, nor did reverence him. Septuagint once again shortens it to a smaller statement, which basically says the same thing. Mordecai did not reverence him. So they removed the bowed as a repetitive thing. And then Haman was full of wrath versus he was full of wrath. Again, he is the more likely original because it's a pronoun instead of the noun of the name. Again, the pronoun issue, Haman versus he, in verse 6. We got the squiggly line for Mordecai. That's because at the end of that verse, we see Mordecai again. Mordecai's people. Okay. And then, interestingly, at 6, we have a full statement, sentence, not in any other version. It says, since Haman was provoked and all his rage was stirred up, he turned red, driving him from his sight, and with a malicious heart, he kept speaking evil to the king about Israel. Again, that's nowhere in the other versions. So quite interesting insertion there. Masoretic, in the first month, that is the month Nisan. Septuagint does not have that detail. The Old Latin does. So something significant about the Old Latin is the Old Latin is supposed to be a translation of the Septuagint, but occasionally it has things that agree with the Masoretic. So there's two explanations for that. Either the Old Latin version consulted the Hebrew text that we're familiar with and included some of those variants periodically, or the original Septuagint may have had that statement, and it was just simply removed by a later scribe. So those are the two possibilities there. They cast pur, that is the lot. The Hebrew word pur, it's actually a Persian word, and they say the translation is it means lot. The Septuagint doesn't mention the name pur in this instance. So here we've got, it was the 12th month, which is Adar. The Septuagint says the lot fell on the 14th of the month, which is Adar. Okay, let's see here. And Haman said to Xerxes the king, the Old Latin shortens it to just say, and he said, or he spoke with the king. So Old Latin, interestingly, does not say Haman or Xerxes. The Septuagint does not say Haman, so it agrees with he, but it does say Xerxes or Artaxerxes, it says. Old Latin then says, text that's not in any other version, he spoke with the king with a deceitful heart regarding the people of the Jews, and he said, I don't know why I have it bolded here for scattered abroad. It should not be bolded. Because bolded should be there when the other versions, some of the other versions don't have it. So I gotta, again, sometimes there's a few mistakes that I'll have to fix in more editing. But once again, here's the issue of the Septuagint condensing a fuller statement into a summary statement. Scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples. Septuagint says scattered abroad among the peoples. In all the provinces of thy kingdom, Septuagint shortens it, in all thy kingdom. The second line adds a people of war and insubordinate. Interestingly, Josephus says a very similar statement. So Josephus's text seems to agree with that extra statement in the second version. Here we've got in the first line the laws of the king. Second line, the laws of thine, O king, or the laws of yours, O king. Your laws, O king. The laws of the king, Septuagint, and then the laws of yours, or your laws. So the second version and the fourth version. Alpha text and the Old Latin both agree saying your laws, but the second line says your laws, O king. And remember I told you guys about that issue where the could be confused with O or vice versa. So the original text may have said O king and it was confused as the king. So scribes were like, well, it says the king, so your isn't correct. So we should remove your. That's what seems to have happened here. Um, verse 9, let this nation be written or be given. The second line and fourth line say, to me, I will pay 10,000 talents. All the other versions of Old Latin say of silver to the hands of those that have the charge of the business to bring. That's in the Masoretic, not in any other version. Unto the king's treasury. The Masoretic and Septuagint say kings, but the Old Latin says thy treasury. So it is possible thy may be the correct reading. But interestingly enough, Josephus, instead of 10,000 talents, he claims 40,000 talents. Now, all other versions say 10, so 10 is probably the correct reading, but it is possible that 40 is the correct reading. Now we have a thing here where it's marked as 10a, but then you see CF11. That's because this statement occurs later on in the other versions. So the second line has this text earlier for some reason. The king said to him, the silver is given to thee, and the people do as pleases thee. And is given to thee, and the people do as pleases thee. So let's go to 11 for a second. On page 22, 11, and we see the same statement, but it's just a little bit later. And the king said to Haman, the silver is given to thee, and the people do as pleases thee. Masoretic, to do with them as pleases thee. So clearly it's the same text, just in a different location. So now, same page, but at the top of the page, 10b. And the remember I said hand versus hands? The Septuagint says hands. Or it makes it plural sometimes when the Masoretic is singular. This is an example. So the Masoretic has Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite. The other versions just say Haman. Now, I mentioned before how it seems unlikely that they would keep saying his full name like that every time they say Haman. So just the short Haman is probably the correct reading. The scribes sometimes have the tendency to add the full name because they don't want people to think it's someone else with the same name. So they're saying Haman, not a different Haman, but the same Haman that's the son of Hammedatha. Now take a look. It says CF12, saying, write to all the provinces and seal it with the signet ring of the king, for there is none who will reject the seal. So now we go to verse 12, and we see that same statement is broken up. I reproduced that same statement so you can see that it's clearly the same. So it's in parentheses. Anything in parentheses is corresponding to that. So write, and then a little bit lower, to, and then a little lower, and seal it with the king's ring, for there is none who will reject the seal. So you see, it occurs later in the second line. And I've talked to you guys before about rearranged text. It happens quite a lot in different books of the Bible. So rearranged text is not surprising. It happens in many versions of different books. The king's scribes were called in the first month on the 13th day. The second line says, Haman, Although that's squiggly line, that's because Haman occurs later on in the same verse in the other versions. All that Haman commanded. But then it says, went to his gods to learn the day of their death. So the mention of gods is uncharacteristic because remember, in the original or the regular text, God and religion is not mentioned at all, right? So it would be weird for all the other versions to agree that God's not mentioned, but then the second version mentions gods. Of course, they're false gods or they're other gods, but they're not. But they're still gods, so it seems foreign to the other versions. So I don't think the God's reading in this instance is correct. Okay, let's see here. Interestingly, the Septuagint says in every province from India even to Ethiopia, to the 127 provinces, and to the rulers of the peoples. So this is an instance where it seems like the Masoretic incorrectly omits that phrase. Because every other place in the same parallel language, that phrase occurs in the Masoretic and Septuagint. So this was probably removed accidentally in the Masoretic version. And then once again, we have the same phenomenon as I pointed out to you guys earlier, where according to the writing thereof in every people after their language, the Septuagint shortens it, just like it did in the other examples I shared with you guys. Okay, so now verse 13, all the Jews in the Masoretic versus the people of the Jews in the Septuagint. Not clear which reading is correct. Let's see. Interestingly, the Masoretic says in one day, whereas the Septuagint says in the first day. So the Septuagint says in the first day of the 12th month, but the Masoretic says in one day in the 13th of the 12th month. So the correct wording is the 13th day. The Septuagint incorrectly makes it look like it's the first day. And it looks like I need to fix the marking there for the fourth line after the people of the Jews. I need to mark it. In the second line, and he hurried and delivered it into the hands of swift horsemen, not in the other versions. Okay, so as you guys can see, occasionally I've made some typos, so I'll have to fix that later on, but that's okay. I'm not publishing it yet, so there's still opportunity to alter the errors. But so now we were just told Haman wrote a letter from the king in the name of the king to the people about the destruction of the Jews. So where did this letter go? It's not in our version. It's not in the Masoretic text. However, it is in the Septuagint. The full letter it claims to have. So we're going to read that now. And this is one of the primary features of the Septuagint version this is one of the primary features of the Septuagint version is it adds letters, not in the Masoretic version. So here is the letter. We're going to read from the third line. Now we're going to read the full thing. I've been going through the variants for you guys and just reading the variants, but the entire thing is a variant, not in our copy. So I'm going to read the whole text so you can have the full context. All right. And the following is a copy of the letter. The great king Artaxerxes to the rulers and satraps of the 127 provinces, from India even to Ethiopia, to I'm sorry, I'm reading the wrong line. This gets confusing because there's 5 lines. Okay. The great king, Artaxerxes, writes thus to the rulers and satraps of the 127 provinces from India even to Ethiopia, who hold authority, ruling over many nations, and having obtained dominion over the whole world. I was minded, not elated by the confidence of power, but ever conducting with great moderation and with gentleness to make the lives of subjects continually tranquil, desiring both to maintain the kingdom quiet and orderly to the utmost limits, and to restore the peace desired by all men. When I had inquired of my counselors how this should be brought to pass, Haman, who excels in soundness of judgment among us, and has been manifestly well inclined, without wavering and with unshaken fidelity, and has obtained the second post in the kingdom, informed us that a certain ill-disposed people is mixed up with all the tribes throughout the world, opposed to every nation in their laws, and continually neglecting the commands of the kings, so that the united government, blamelessly administered by us, is not quietly established. Having then conceived that this nation alone is continually set in opposition to every man, introducing as a change of a foreign code of laws, injuriously plotting to accomplish the worst of evils against our interests and against the happy establishment of our monarchy, we have accordingly appointed those who are signified to you in the letters written by Haman, who is set over the affairs, and is our second father, to utterly destroy them all with their wives and children by the swords of their enemies, without pitying or sparing any on the 14th of the 12th month, Adar, of the present year. Uh, the second line says, in order to eliminate all the Jews and take their children as plunder. Okay. That the people aforetime and now ill disposed, having been violently consigned to death in one day, may hereafter secure to us continually a well constituted and quiet affairs. And the second line is the only one that says, but anyone who has hidden the people of the Jews will not live, not only among humans, but also among birds, and they will be consumed by holy fire, and their wealth will be transferred into the kingdom. Greetings. That might be wrong. That might be the 4th line. Let me just quickly double check that. Let me see here. I got to double check that because I don't want to state falsely. Yeah, so that is actually the 4th line. Anyone who has hidden the people. Yeah. So my friend, I believe he put it in the second line, and that's why I got confused. Because sometimes he puts it in the wrong line accidentally. So I got to put that at the 4th line, not the second line. In fact, I'm going to do that right now as I'm doing this. The easy fix. So that was the letter. So what are your guys' opinion? To me, that sounds like an authentic letter, because the Masoretic text says such a letter was written, and yet we don't have that letter. So what happened? Did it get lost forever, or did such a letter once exist? And if it did exist, then it would make sense that the people of that time had access to that letter still, so they probably included a copy in the original version of Esther. So now we shall move on. Let me just check this one text here. Yeah. Okay, so verse 14, page 26. The last line says, the king sealed it with his royal ring and gave to his fastest riders. That's not in the other versions. But so now the Masoretic text continues at this point. The second line, the second version is missing up until part later of verse 15. So let's see here. I'm just going to try to skip some of this. Okay, the fourth line in verse 15. All the peoples made a banquet, but Haman, when he entered the citadel, indulged himself in the company of friends. That's not in any of the other versions. Okay, so now we're on to chapter 4a. Okay, so now the fourth line, the Old Latin, this is a little bit confusing. So basically, the different versions disagree where this line is to be included. So the Old Latin has it first. Wheresoever a copy of the letter was published, there was wailing and great mourning amongst all the Jews. So the Masoretic and the Septuagint have that same text in verse 3. So scroll down to verse 3. I'm sorry, it said, what does it say? It says 4b verse 3, because this is 4a. So it's not 4a verse 3, but 4b verse 3. It has that same line. So that would be on page 31. And so we'll see 31 verse 3. In every province wheresoever the king's command and his decree came, there was weeping and wailing and great mourning amongst the Jews. So that's the parallel. And then it says 4a. It also occurs in 4a0. That's where we were before. But then it says also CF1 or 4b1. So go up to 4b1. That's on the prior page. So it says, Mordecai perceived all that was done, and the city of Shushan was in turmoil because of what had taken place. In the whole city there was great and bitter mourning amongst the Jews. So it's that same phrase, but three different versions have it in a different place. They've rearranged it for some reason. Okay, so now we can return back to where we were, page 28, verse 1. And the Jews were calling upon the God of their fathers, and they were saying, Lord God, thou alone art God in heaven above, and there is no other God beside thee. For if we had done thy law and commands, perhaps we would have dwelled in peace for the entire time of our life. But now, because we didn't do thy commands, all this tribulation has come upon us. Thou art just, serene, lofty, and great, O Lord, and all thy ways are judgments. And now, God, do not give thy children over to captivity, nor our wives to rape, nor to destruction. Whoops, I have that twice. I need to delete that later. Thou who have been made gracious toward us from Egypt until now, have mercy on thy first portion, and don't give over our inheritance into disgrace so that enemies will dominate us. And in Shushan, in the city nearest the king, a copy had been displayed, and the things written were known. So no other version has that, but Old Latin does. So the question is that authentic? That sounds like a quite authentic reading, doesn't it? But someone might say, well, it's troubling that none of the other versions have it. Well, guess what? Josephus alludes to this. So let me point you to exactly where Josephus. So can you open Josephus for a second? In Antiquities, it's book 11. Okay, so now when you're there, it's section 2, where it says, he gathered those that were in captivity together beyond Euphrates, and stayed there 3 days, and ordained a fast for them, that they might make their prayers to God for their preservation, that they might suffer no misfortunes by the way, either from their enemies or from any ill accident. Oh, I'm sorry, that's Ezra. It looks like. My bad. What am I talking about? Sorry. That didn't sound right. Okay. My apologies. Let me find it. That was a goof on my part. Um, Hold on. One second here. Um, Sorry, one second. I'm just scanning this. I'm not seeing it where I thought I saw it, so I'll have to move on from that for now. Um, One second here. No, okay. Um, okay, so it's section 8 of chapter 6. Okay, so Mordecai did as Esther had enjoined him, made the people fast. He besought God, together with them, not to overlook his nation. I'm going to skip this. Blah blah blah. And then later on in that same paragraph, it says this in the midway through it, like in the middle. The same supplications did the multitude put up, and entreated that God would provide for their deliverance, and free the Israelites that were in all the earth from this calamity which was now coming upon them. For they had it before their eyes, and expected its coming. So that describes like a summary of their prayer, and there's no community prayer in our version, but there is in the Old Latin. So Josephus there seems to be agreeing with the Old Latin version for that. Okay, so now 4b, chapter 4b, the Old Latin. Then, strangely, this same phrase occurred elsewhere in the book already, but they're doing it again. So there was a Jewish man living in Shushan, serving in the citadel of the king. He was a great man among the king's court, from the tribe of Benjamin, a just man of the captivity, which Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had captured from Jerusalem, along with Jeconiah, king of the Jews. So that's probably was added. Doesn't make sense to have that again. Okay. Let's see here. So different order. So verse 1, the Masoretic and the Septuagint and the Alpha, they all have sackcloth followed by ashes. But in the Old Latin, ashes come first, followed by sackcloth. Interestingly, we're told that Mordecai cried out. The Old Latin tells us he shouted from the men's it should say forecourt, not foreort, but so forecourt to the women's gate, crying out, a nation that has done no wrong is going to be destroyed. That's not in the Masoretic text, but it's in the Septuagint and the Old Latin. And Josephus, I believe, also quotes that same statement. That seems to be authentic. That could perhaps be derived from that special letter that I talked about from chapter 9, the original letter that once existed that's now lost. Okay. So, verse 2, he came to the presence of the king's gate. Septuagint, once again, they remove the presence of. So they're removing like fuller details. Then look at this. It says, none were to enter into the king's gate. But the Septuagint says to enter into the gate. Well, the gate was just mentioned earlier in the verse, so the Septuagint probably is correct in not saying into the king's. I'm sorry, yeah. And the Septuagint says and ashes. The other ones just say sackcloth. Okay, let's see what we got here. These are mostly the same, but the fourth line is the one that's more different. So Esther's maids and her chamberlains came and told her. Masoretic. The Septuagint and the queens instead of Esther. The queen's maids and chamberlains came and told her. Now the Old Latin says and Esther the queen, so it uses both Masoretic Esther and Septuagint queen readings. So Esther the queen heard her brother Mordecai's voice in the Hebrew language. So that is not in any other version. And that seems to be an explanation to the Romans, because the scribe is explaining to the Romans that she spoke it in Hebrew, I guess. I don't know. Okay, so now the Old Latin version has the chamberlain Shatak doing something earlier, whereas the other versions have him later in the next verse. So verse 5, Esther called for Hatak. The Septuagint consistently, instead of saying Hatak, it says Ekrat. So what I would argue happened for the Septuagint is that some of the letters were switched in their order, and then the letter was misread. Some of the letters were misread. So, Hatak, one of the king's chamberlains, Masoretic, versus the Septuagint, her chamberlain. But the Masoretic says, whom he had appointed to attend upon her. Because of the fuller detail of the Masoretic, that's probably the more correct reading. Normally, I would say her chamberlain, but it wouldn't make sense to say her chamberlain whom he had appointed. So the king's one is probably correct. Old Latin says that I may know what my brother wants. The word for brother in Hebrew actually also can just mean relative, so like any close relative. Let's see here. Where Mordecai is in squiggly marks, because in Masoretic, she gave a command to Mordecai. In the Septuagint, know the truth from Mordecai. And then the Old Latin continues. No other version has this. For I hear my brother's voice, a great voice of tribulation, wailing, lamentation, anguish, and need. And the chamberlain versus the Masoretic Hatak. Now, interestingly, the Septuagint doesn't have any of this. It doesn't say Hatak went forth to Mordecai, to the street of the city, which was before the king's gate. Okay, so Old Latin in verse 7 has an extra statement. And he told the chamberlain, Go tell the queen, rise up. Why art thou sitting and keeping silent when you have been sold, thou and thy house, if thou and thy father, the people, and all posterity? Rise up, in case we may be able to labor on behalf of our people and our homeland, so that God might be gracious toward our people. Likewise, about the 10,000 talents that Haman promised in exchange for the Jews' destruction. So this dialogue, I suspect, is from that lost letter that I keep mentioning. That's what I would argue. So I don't think this is originally part of this verse. It was added from that letter, in my opinion. The sum of the money that Haman promised in Masoretic, the other versions say 10,000. I'm inclined to think some of the money is the correct reading, and that the specification of 10,000 was added later, because that detail is found elsewhere, earlier in the text. Haman promised to pay to the king's treasuries. Septuagint, Haman promised the king. Okay, let's see here. On page 33 at the top, it says, the second grouping, it says, for her people. But the second line, alpha text, says, for me and my people. And then the third line of Septuagint says, for the people. And then the Septuagint and alpha text have a statement not in any other version. It's not in the Masoretic. Remembering the days of thy low estate, how thou wert nursed by my hand. For Haman, who holds the next place to the king, he has spoken against us for death. Do thou call upon the Lord and about us to the king, and deliver us from death. It's possible this is supposed to be parallel. Remember I said the Old Latin back in verse 7 has that dialogue? The Old Latin does not have this dialogue here. So maybe this dialogue is supposed to be like a parallel to that earlier Old Latin thing back in verse 7. So once again, it's mentioning God, whereas the Masoretic text doesn't. So I suspect this part is from that letter that I talk about. Verse 9, he made known to her Israel's tribulation. The other versions say, he told Esther Mordecai's words. He told her all these words. It happened when Esther read her brother's words, that's the fourth line, she rent her clothes, cried in a bitter and heavy voice, and lamented with great lament, and her body became fearful, and her flesh collapsed. So here we have, she sent her chamberlain versus Esther spake to Hatak, or Akrat, and then Mordecai versus him, those variants. The king's provinces, verse 11, versus the fourth line, the king Artaxerxes. Let's see here. Verse 12 on page 34. And they told to Mordecai Esther's words, verses, and Akrat told to Mordecai all Esther's words. And then, and the chamberlain went out and told to him her words. I'm inclined to think the Old Latin, because it uses more of the pronouns, and I favor the pronouns. It says, and Mordecai became angry, and he, Old Latin, okay. Old Latin is the only one in verse 13. It says, for I am the king's wife. Okay, so this one is interesting because only one version mentions God. All the others don't. So clearly God is added in this case. So this is verse 14. If you ignore thy nation, okay. If you ignore thy nation and one second. If you ignore altogether, no, I'll just read the first one. My bad. If thou altogether hold thy peace at this time, enlargement and deliverance shall arise to. I need to remove that. It's a repeat. I forgot to remove it. Where it says, "Shall their enlargement?" I got to remove that. Shall arise to the Jews from another place. Look at that. Deliverance shall arise to the Jews from another place in squigglies. But the second line says, shall be to them God. A helper shall be to them God. The actual text says God should be a helper to them. But what's interesting is that the other versions say from another place, whereas the second version doesn't say from another place, it says from God. So the second version interprets it as God is where the salvation shall come from. The other version, like Septuagint, agrees with the Masoretic, ambiguously saying from another place. Where's the other place? It doesn't say. Josephus, strangely, says, shall not come from another place. Let me show you that for a second. If you go back to Josephus. Let's see. Um, One second. Oh, well, this version doesn't say that, but I saw a different version of Josephus that made it look like it said not. But I was going to say, in that version, so what's interesting is that sometimes there's a variant where it says not and the other version doesn't, but it would be translated as shall not. Like, so in other words, if it says deliverance shall arise to the Jews from another place, another version might say, shall not deliverance arise from another place? So the presence of not will not actually change the meaning if you translate it correctly. So whether not is there or not, it actually means the same thing. Deliverance shall arise to the Jews from another place versus and deliverance shall not deliverance arise from another place. Okay. Verse 15. Old Latin is the only one that says, and the chamberlain went in and reported Mordecai's words back to Esther the queen. And then Um, second. So as I go through this, I sometimes fix things, but when I fix things, it then puts things on the wrong page. So all right. Um, verse 16. Lord, brother, if it seems right to thee, I will enter, even though I might die. Remember, I said earlier that it's possible she called Mordecai her Lord, and that's why it says earlier that God, like it says God, um, in let's see, that was in where was it? Okay, that was in verse 20 on page 17, where to fear God and do His commandments, where His is referring to Mordecai, His commandment. I said it's possible the text said to fear the Lord, to fear her Lord, Mordecai being her Lord, and sure enough, interestingly, she calls Mordecai Lord in the Old Latin version, Lord brother. If it seems right to thee, I will enter, even though I may die. I'm not saying that's the correct reading. I'm just uh, saying that it's an interesting corroboration of the possibility that Esther could call Mordecai Lord, and that's where the confusion could be, because she's calling a man Lord, and it's being interpreted as the Lord by the scribes, or being interpreted as God. Here we got another example where God is added in the second version, which makes it more, which reinforces the view that sometimes the scribes are adding God into the text when that should not originally be part of the text. So, verse 16, gathered all the Jews and fast for me, and neither eat nor drink 3 days, night and day. The second line says, and petition God earnestly. It doesn't mention anything about fasting, not eating and drinking. So, the second line is clearly inferior. Fourth line, and instruct the elders to make a fast and let them separate nursing children from their mothers at night. Let oxen and cattle not be pastured for 3 days. This has animals fasting, basically, um, which, interestingly enough, uh, in the book of Jonah, they do the same thing. Animals fast for 3 days. And in the book of Judith, I believe the same thing occurs, if I remember correctly. So, okay. Um, all right, let me see what we got here. Uh, yeah, so I was just about to say, Christopher. Uh, I was assuming you wanted to end it around this time, but I was going to double check. I just saw your chat here.
Sure.
Um, so we did cover a lot, but clearly, I kind of knew we weren't going to finish the whole thing, but I was hoping we would. But I did spend a lot of time on the variants, so if I had gone it a little bit quicker, we may have covered more ground. But so we have been making good progress, though. So if you want me to finish this, I can do one more. I would not do more than one more because uh, I think one more would be sufficient. So what do you think? Do you want me to do one more, and that would be tomorrow, uh, or are you busy tomorrow, or another time? Or do you not want to do it? Let me know what your thoughts are.
I think that we have a really good idea of what you have produced this product. So I don't really think it's really necessary to go through every single word of it, like, or to go through all the way to the end. So Yeah, I think like this. I think it's an amazing work, and I think that everybody, I would highly recommend that everybody, get a copy of it whenever you release it. But as far as doing another whole video, I don't, um, yeah, I don't think that's really necessary at this time.
Okay, so if that's the case, I'd like you to just give me a small amount of time, not long, but to just uh, explain what we're not covering.
Okay.
Yeah. So basically, um, for the rest of the text that we did not cover, there's a few big sections that are quite interesting that I would recommend to you guys. Um, so first of all, also to mention, the Old Latin sometimes has stuff not in the other versions. But basically, the main extra stuff will be in all the other versions besides the Masoretic text, all three versions. So that's we have what comes now, what we would have done, what we would have started reading, had we continued, was chapter 4c, and that is the prayer of Mordecai. So there's a lengthy prayer where Mordecai prays to God for salvation of his people. And that would be derived from that lost letter that I've talked about. So the full text of the letter you can actually read in any version of the Septuagint, the Brenton text, and that's basically, for the most part, that the Brenton version presents the correct text of the prayer of Mordecai. So directly after the prayer of Mordecai comes the uh, comes the prayer of Esther, and there's a very lengthy prayer of Esther, and in that prayer, she basically gives her. She says that she has been righteous and has been obeying the laws of God, and she prays her for her the salvation for her people as well. So that's like I said, it's quite a lengthy prayer for hers. It's even longer than Mordecai's. So that would have also been from that extra letter. Then comes chapter 5, and the Septuagint version has a much longer account of Esther going into the king and going into the king uninvited, because she was afraid coming into the king because she was not invited. Well, the Septuagint has a significantly longer text of that, so I would recommend reading that as well, because it mentions God as well a lot in that. And I would argue also that that longer description is a extract from that lost letter of chapter 9. And then there's small differences between the Septuagint all throughout, like kind of comparable to the differences we've mentioned so far, and occasionally interesting differences between the other versions, like Alpha or the Old Latin. But the big differences in particular are there's another letter. Remember, I mentioned there was a letter earlier on. There is another letter that is, in fact, included in the Septuagint text, and that is the letter that Esther and Mordecai ask the king to revoke Haman's earlier letter. So that is a full letter, a long, lengthy letter where they speak in the name of the king to undo that letter. And that will be found at the end of chapter 8, right around the end of chapter 8, which in my document is chapter 8b. And I told you guys before in the last video about the dream of Mordecai. He had the dream and then the fulfillment of the dream. So that would have come from the lost letter as well. And I think that's pretty much it. There'll be differences in order of verses occasionally for a few instances between the different versions. And something also to point out significantly is that the Alpha text and the in the Old Latin have a much shorter version of chapter 9. But that seems to be secondary, and the fuller version, like in Masoretic and Septuagint, is more accurate. So that's just to give you guys an overview there. And like I said, Josephus has some very peculiar variants that seem to be from a lost version of Esther that are not in any other version. So I would definitely recommend taking Josephus's text, what he says, and kind of comparing it to see some of these differences. So that's the review. If I had known this would be the last one, I probably would have done it a little bit differently to try to prioritize those extra long chapters, but that's okay. As you guys know, the clear difference is the presence of God throughout and religion throughout the entirety versus the Masoretic with no mention of God, no religion at all. My theory about why that is mentioned in the first video of the series that I've been doing with Christopher Enoch. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed it. There was one question I wanted to answer, and that is, have you done a breakdown like this for the Torah? I plan to do a breakdown for each book of the Old Testament, but at this time, I have not done that yet, and that's going to be the last thing for the Old Testament I do, because it's such a massive scale, and there's so many different witnesses I have to incorporate. And it's the most important of the whole thing. So I'm going to do that way at the end of this process. Probably sometime next year, I'll be working on it. But that's what I have to say. So any final thoughts, questions? Christopher Enoch, did you want to say anything?
It's just an amazing work you've done, Onieh. I think it's like, what else? I think I described there in a previous video. It's almost like writing a dictionary.
Yeah.
It's very, I can see it. It's just so, what, I don't know what word to use other than, it's just so thorough and exhaustive, really.
Yeah, it's exhausting, all right. but when I do the translation as well, that's going to be even more amazing, I believe, because it's just going to bring out the depth and beauty of the Hebrew language more clearly. But to simplify it for everybody who wants the original text and they have to wait, here's what I'm going to tell you. For all the other parts, besides the what's called the 6 extra sections in the Septuagint, go with the Masoretic text. For the most part, the Masoretic text is clearly superior, as I was showing you guys throughout. Besides like pronoun things, here and there, pronoun things, Masoretic is clearly superior majority of the time to the individual variant comparisons. I believe what I showed today is some compelling basis for that. But for those extra sections, read the Brenton version. And the 2 lengthy letters that are included, keep those in their places. But the other lengthy additions, consider those part of a lost letter that once existed in chapter 9. That would be what I would recommend. And that's basically the original Esther. If you want to figure it out on your own, like that is how you would reconstruct it. So, hope that helps you guys.
All right. Well, let us know when you're finished, the final copy or, the final product of this book, and definitely I'll be sharing the message.
Any more questions about it, you can contact me on this YouTube video in the comments. I might not see it right away, or this is paired also to my YouTube channel, so you can comment on that, or send me a message on Facebook. I'll be happy to address anything else, or if you have any questions about anything that's not even related to Esther, but it could be another book in line with the same process, like questions about textual criticism, you can contact me and I will do my best to answer your questions. In the meantime, hope you guys enjoyed this video and continue to support Christopher Enoch, and I do hope to be back again at some point. We will, if you want me back, we will try to think another topic. We won't figure it out right now or what time, but we'll email each other and we'll try to figure out some other topic you'd want me to talk about.
Sure, sure. Yeah. So once again, Onieh, thank you. I see we have just quickly again in the chat. We have Tammy says shalom all, shalom Tammy. Good to see you. Corey says shalom, brother Chris and chat. Thank you very much, Corey. Shalom. Good to see you. Yeah. So we'll yeah, we'll keep in touch, and again, the work is just an amazing work. I think in its uh, it really it to me it really proves, it shows how just the different variants of the manuscripts, and like you were saying that in your view the Masoretic text is the most accurate. Now I don't, you wouldn't say
Uh,
it
in,
like
in this, for the Book of Esther, for the parts that are not the huge major additions, the Masoretic seems to be more reliable in this Book of Esther.
okay.
But your question was like about across the board, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So across the board, it's different depending which book you do. It used to be the case that I was like Septuagint all the way, almost 99% of the time. It's probably best to say, this is obviously a random number, but I would say 50-50. So in my estimation, based on my greater knowledge of the differences in textual criticism that I've since learned in recent years, I would say it's much more of like an equal footing where half the time the Masoretic has a better reading overall, and the other time, half the time, Septuagint does. And in some books, it's a lot more. So I can, in a future time, maybe I could do like a list of which books are the Masoretic better ones, and the other which books are the Septuagint better ones. I can go through that with you guys.
All right. Okay. Well, yeah, we're gonna wrap it up here, and yeah, once again, Onieh, thank you. Such a blessing, and your work has been such a blessing. I mean, yeah, I mean, you've been a blessing to me. I pray that everyone that listens to your material will be blessed as much as I have been by your content. And so, for those of you who do, kind of listen to this and you want more of Onieh's content, the links are in the description. I have his YouTube channel there and his Facebook group as well. So you can connect with them that way as well. So, all right. Thanks again, Onieh. Blessings, blessings, blessings. What a wonderful, there's a lot of stuff. I'm telling you, you have said that you are a scribe, and right. I remember you saying,
Yeah,
I'm a scribe, and I can see it. It's like, yeah, I don't even think you probably most of the scribes didn't even do what you're doing here.
the closest would be Origen, the church father who did the Hexapla.
Okay.
Yeah,
Wow. It's amazing work.
thank
Definitely.
you. I appreciate it.
Not too many people would have the determination and perseverance and patience to go through everything like you did, for sure.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you for having me on.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure, and thank you for coming on. We'll keep in touch. And everyone else in the live chat and everyone else watching, once again, thank you guys for listening and watching. Um, if you have any questions, again, you can contact me at my email or contact Onieh through his channels and on Facebook as well. But I just pray that everything that we shared here is a great blessing to you. And so, yeah, thank you, everyone. You're awesome.
One final thing I'll say is I might separately I might do because it just feels so unfinished, the series. Maybe on my channel I'll do a final part uh, going through the rest of it, and then you could put it in a link later on. You could edit this video and put it in a link to say, for the rest of for the final part of this, go to his channel.
Yeah, that sounds good. That sounds good.
All right, that sounds. All right, thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome, Onieh. Thank you again. Okay, as always, I pray for each one of you that the Lord bless you and keep you, make his face to shine upon you, lift up his countenance upon you, and give you wonderful, wonderful shalom. See you again tomorrow night, 7 p.m. Blessings.